guys, it's Tina and I am back, and I am here with a very exciting swatch and review video featuring the Kat Von D MetalMatte Eyeshadow Palette that is brand new for holiday 2016, and I was personally excited to get my hands on this palette because it's bold and colorful and right up my alley. And it features 22 eyeshadow shades. We have 13 all matte shades in one row, and then at the top we have 9 shades that features her Metal Crush Eyeshadow formula from her regular single eyeshadow lineup, and I couldn't wait to try this out. And I will admit I was a little bit skeptical after the whole letdown of the Serpentina palette that I thought had such potential to be great, and it failed me miserably. And I was like, please don't let that be the same outcome for this palette. Now, I'll get into my review after we jump into the swatches, which we're gonna do right now. So here's an overall look at the shades that are included in the palette. In the first row, we have the Metal Crush Eyeshadow, starting with Nebula, Watt, Ignite. Then we have Tinsel, Glitz, Twinkle, followed by Volt, Synergy, and Flash. Then in the second row, we have all matte shades, starting out with Linen, Jet, Velour. Then we have Stone, Moss, Ribbon, followed by Silk, Fringe, Feather, and then we have Oak, Suede, Bone, and Velvet. So I will be applying these swatches over a very light layer of primer on my arm using my Kat Von D Shade and Light eyeshadow brush. And I'm using the dome side of the brush. And we'll start out with the Metal Crush eyeshadows. There are 9 shades. And the first shade up is Flash, which is described as a metallic gold. And this one is a beautiful, almost mustard yellow gold. This one is not an intense high shine frosty shade, which is great for a color such as this, so it will make it a little bit more wearable. Then the next shade we have is Synergy, which is a metallic bronze, and this shade is a part of her permanent Metal Crush eyeshadow collection. Synergy is described as a metallic bronze shade, and this one is a smooth brownie bronze shade. It has great pigmentation, it applies beautifully, and it blends out like a dream. This one will make a beautiful neutral eye. And then next to that we have the shade Volt, which is described as a metallic violet. This one is more of a dirty grape shade. It takes a little bit to build it up, but it's a very subtle, deep red grape shade. Really beautiful for a subtle purple look as well. Then we have the shade Twinkle, which is a metallic lilac. This one is a beautiful light lavender lilac shade. Has a great pinky undertone as well, a really beautiful highlight shade. This would make a beautiful highlight shade for the inner tear duct or for the center of the lid. Then we have the shade Glitz, which is described as a metallic rose gold. This one is more of a pinky champagne shade. This one has great color payoff and pigmentation for such a light shade, and it's really smooth. This one again would work great for inner tear duct highlight or on the center of the lid. Then next to that we have the shade Tinsel, which is described as a metallic pewter. This one has a little bit of a different texture than the other shades. It's a little bit more flaky or a little bit more chunky in texture, and it applies a little bit more sheerly, but you can definitely build it up. It does have a lot of glitter to it, but if you smooth that out it will stick to the lid. But just be careful with this one. This one looks like it will have some fallout issues. The next shade is Ignite, and this one is described as a metallic seafoam. And it's more of a pale seafoam aqua shade. It's like a very light, almost washed out mermaidy teal shade. And then we have the shade Watt, which is described as a metallic teal. This guy, oh my god, this one is a deep metallic teal shade. It's smooth, it has great pigmentation, it applies in one swipe, but you can definitely build it up. This one would make a gorgeous smoky eye, or even pop it on the lower lash line for that pop of color that's still smoky. really gorgeous. And then last up in the Metallic Crush eyeshadows, we have the shade Nebula. This one is described as a metallic navy. This one is another jewel tone shade. It's richly pigmented, really gorgeous. There's nothing quite unique about this shade, but it has beautiful pigmentation and applies like a dream. So here are the 9 Metal Crush shades. I think all of them are beautiful. They have great pigmentation. The only thing that was a little stiffer and felt like it had a different formula than the others is the Volt shade. This one is a little bit stiffer in the pan, but it still applies well. You just have to pack it on a little bit more and really rub your brush against the eyeshadow. And then Tinsel, which is this chunkier, flakier texture, that one's gonna have a little bit of fallout because of the glitter, but it still applies smoothly and it has great color payoff. I was actually worried about that shade, but I applied it to my lid and it applied smoothly without any issues. Then next up we have the 13 matte eyeshadows. We're gonna start with the shade Linen, which is a matte white. And Linen is just like it says, it's a creamy matte white shade. Now whites are a little bit difficult to do, but this one is actually pretty decent and it layers up well. It's still a sheer shade though, but if you concentrate it, you can get great color payoff, and it's really smooth as well, not choppy or chalky at all. And then we have the shade Jet, which is described as a matte black. Now Jet is exactly what it says, it's just a matte black shade. But as you can see, it's not choppy or chalky or anything, and it applies pretty smoothly and builds up pretty nicely. And I like that it's smooth and it doesn't feel gritty at all, so that would be a good color to build up a smokiness in the crease or on your lower lash line. Next to that we have the shade Velour, which is described as a matte royal blue. I picked up quite a lot of product for this one, just because it's a matte blue and I didn't expect too much, but look how smoothly that applies. It's really pigmented. Again, it's not skipping, it's not dragging on my arm. That is really beautiful. And it's as described, it's a royal blue and it's richly pigmented, and I'm just loving how inky that looks on my skin tone. Then we have the shade Stone. Stone is described as a matte cement gray. Stone is a beautiful deep charcoal gray shade. I wouldn't quite call it cement. Cement is a little bit lighter. This one is rich and deep, and it looks like it has a bit of a more neutral undertone. It leans a little bit warmer than a cool blue undertone. And it even looks like it has a touch of like a sage green to it. Don't mind me, I'm just going extra with my color descriptions. And here we have the shade Moss, which is described as a matte forest green. This one is a matte, more of a grass green shade, like a deep grass green. This one has a little bit more of a choppy payoff in the initial swipe, but let's see if we can build this up. It does build up a little bit better, but again, be careful with this one. If you apply it in a large area, it's gonna be a little bit more choppy than the other ones that we've swatched so far. But in a concentrated spot like the outer crease or lower lash line, you shouldn't have an issue with this one. Then next we have the purples. We have the shade Ribbon, which is described as a matte deep purple. This one again is a little bit like Moss. It's not a dry texture at all, but it does come off a little bit patchy in some areas, so you do have to layer it up. And again, just like Moss, if you use this over a large area like your entire lid, you're gonna see that patchiness come through and you're gonna need to build it up, or use a sticky primer with it. But it's a little bit patchy, but it's not dry at all. It's still a smooth texture. Then next we have the shade Silk, which is described as a matte terracotta. I don't know if that color description is right though, because this is not a terracotta. Terracotta is more of an orangey, a burnt orange tone. This one is definitely more just a rosy mauve shade. Beautiful color payoff too for such a pinky purpley tone. That one would actually work great to blend out ribbon in the crease. Then we have the shade Fringe, which is described as a matte peach. Fringe is a beautiful, smooth matte peach shade, and it really shows up strongly as a light peach on my skin tone, which is a little bit tricky for my complexion that this doesn't show up ashy. It actually has some warmth to it. So this would actually make a great brow highlight, an inner tear duct highlight, or just applying all over the lid as a light lid shade, or you can mix it in with the other shades to lighten them up a bit. I'm really liking this shade. And then we have the shade Feather, which is described as a matte dandelion yellow. That is such a beautiful color description. It's like a pale straw yellow shade. It's definitely a very light yellow shade. A little bit more sheer in pigmentation, nothing too intense here. Again, you can use this color as a blend-in shade to help create lighter shades and mix with the other ones to make them blend a little better. And then next to that we have the shade Oak, which is a matte chocolate brown. Oak is such a beautiful chocolatey brown shade. That is gorgeous and it applies smoothly. There's no patchiness. It's really creamy. It has full color payoff. Just be careful, this one will deepen up on your skin if it's damp at all. As you can see, this one got a little deep. This one's actually a great shade for smoky eyes or using as an alternative to the black shade. It's a really beautiful rich brown shade. And then next to that we have the shade Suede, which is described as a matte fawn. This one is a beautiful light caramelly peachy brown shade. This one would actually probably work great as a blend-in shade for me or a transition shade. Even though it is a little bit lighter than my skin tone, it still blends in pretty nicely. And it's really smooth. That's a really buttery shade. And then we have the shade Bone, which is described as a matte cream. Bone is a beautiful peachy ivory shade and that color payoff is fantastic. It actually applies better than the matte white shade Linen and it still looks white on my skin tone. So this one is probably interchangeable with Linen. And again, you can use this shade mixed with other shades to lighten them up, even act as a highlight on the inner tear duct, just a matte highlight. And then last up we have the shade Velvet, which is described as a matte deep plum. Velvet is a matte deep burgundy shade and it's really smooth. As you can see, it applies without being patchy at all. Really beautiful shade. Again, a great alternative to black. Great for warm looks, great for cranberry looks, great for those plum looks in the holiday season. That's a really smooth, beautiful shade. So again, here's a look at the 13 matte shades in the palette. All of these shades have a smooth, buttery texture and they apply pretty well. None of them were chalky or choppy. The only ones I know will be an issue would be Moss and Ribbon, the dark green and the dark purple shade. Those are a little bit choppier and they take some layering up. So just be mindful of that when you're working with them. They might blend out a little bit more easily than the other ones that just picked up instantly in pigmentation. But other than that, the shades show up great on my skin tone. They have nice color payoff. They are very smooth and they're very true to color as well. And you have a great selection of neutrals, blend-in shades, some dark smoky shades. I think overall this shade selection is fantastic. And you have some great blend-in transition shades as well that I think would work on the majority of skin tones. And you can mix any of the shades together to deepen them, to lighten them. And I think you can just get a boatload of looks from this palette. And here is a look at all 22 shades available in this palette. Alright guys, now that you have seen the swatches, we can go ahead and jump into the review and get into the real nitty-gritty of the palette to see if this is something you want to check out for yourself. And as usual, the first thing I like to talk about is price. Now this palette does retail for $60 and as I mentioned, you get 22 shades in this palette and each of the shades are 1.7 grams or 0.06 ounces, which is actually a pretty sizable amount of eyeshadow. The small Urban Decay single eyeshadows are 0.05 ounces. The MAC eyeshadows are 0.05 ounces. So you are getting more than each of those eyeshadows in each of these 22 shades available in this palette, which actually works out to a great value for your money. You end up paying a little over $2.70 for each eyeshadow. And remember, 9 of the shades in this palette do feature her Metal Crush Eyeshadow formula, which retails for $21 for 0.01 ounce. So you're getting 60% of one of these shades in each of these 9 shades, which gives you a total value of over $113 just for the Metal Crush eyeshadows, because it equates to about 5.4 shades in Metal Crush eyeshadows that you're getting in this palette. So just by those 9 eyeshadows, you're already getting a great deal. And we didn't account for the other 13 shades in here, which are her all matte shades, but I don't have references for her single eyeshadows in a matte formula. And when you compare it up against last year's holiday palette from Kat Von D, the Mi Vida Loca Remix palette, you did get 24 shades in this palette. Again, a very colorful palette. This one had 0.04 ounces per shade. You did get 2 extra shades, but there were only 0.04 ounces. So you're getting more product than you got last year, and this palette retailed for $59. So you're only getting a price increase of $1 over the year, and you're getting far more product than this. This palette had 0.96 ounces. This guy has 1.32 ounces. So you're getting a lot more product, even though you're losing 2 shades. And even when you compare it up against other mid-range brands on the market, like the Urban Decay palettes, these naked palettes are $54 and they contain only 12 shades and they're 0.05 ounces. So each of these shades are smaller than the ones you get in the Kat Von D palette, and you're getting more shades. It does cost more, but when you equate it price per ounce, you're really getting a bargain there. Even up against the Too Faced chocolate bar palette. So this retails for $49 and you get 16 shades in this. And again, these smaller shades are 0.04 ounces and then the larger shades are 0.02 ounces. This is still $49 for 16 shades. You get 6 more shades and more product in the Kat Von D palette. So I think this price-wise is such a great value. I'm just so surprised that you get so much product for the price. So value-wise, you're definitely getting your money's worth right here. Now let's go ahead and talk about the packaging, which I think is one of the standout things about this palette. I mean, there's so many things that stand out about this palette, but the packaging is definitely one of those things. And it is very simple compared to her previous packaging. Mi Vida Loca Remix, my friends. This guy I found so awkward and just so bulky. It was hard to store, hard to use. It was just very awkward for me, so I can't even pull it out now. But it was a very awkward packaging. Beautiful. I mean, artistically, it's gorgeous. It's a really beautiful collector's item. But if you really want to get use out of your palette, you probably want something a little bit more practical. And I think they did try to achieve that with this packaging. Now, I think the one thing that a lot of people have mentioned, and a lot of people are like, oh my god, it's a very large palette. It is very, very big. Let's compare it to the Serpentina palette, which I thought was huge in the first place. This one is even longer than it and even wider. It is just not as thick, which I appreciate. It's a thinner packaging, but to be fair, the Serpentina palette did have to house that little pigment packaging, which is a little thicker. The palette is a hard cardboard palette and it does have some heft to it. It is a very heavy duty cardboard packaging and it does have some weight to it as well, which is something that took me by surprise. When I got the palette, I was like, holy crap, this is heavy. Initially, you're like, wow, that is heavier than any other palette that I've felt in my life. But it's because it is a weighted cardboard packaging. The palette is a black and chrome silver theme, and as is typical with Kat Von D, she uses her signature lettering, which is kind of a gothic style lettering. And it just flows with all her palettes. She uses the same lettering. It might even be patented to her brand itself. And the interesting thing about the lettering on the front of the palette, which I thought was so genius, was that it uses an ambigram technique, which means the word will look different depending on which way you look at it. So when you look at it like this, it says metal, but when you turn it the other way over, it says matte. That is so genius and so well executed. It's just beautiful because the palette is the Metal Matte palette. On the back of the palette, it does give you all the names of the eyeshadows along with the sizing information and manufacturing information. And for reference, this palette was made in the USA. It is eye safe and it does have a usage life of 12 months once you open the packaging. Now, keep in mind that these are powder eyeshadows. If you take care of them, keep them out of heat and direct sunlight, and sanitize them when you use them, you should be able to use this for well past 12 months. You can use this for a couple of years for sure. Now, the palette is secured by a magnetic clasp in the flap. Now, that's not my favorite way to hold a palette secure, but I haven't had any issues with a magnetic clasp, and this seems to be a pretty secure magnet. I would just prefer to have like a tab fit closure or an extra flap just to really hold it secure for when you're traveling. Inside the palette, you do have a pretty full-size mirror. It extends almost, I would say, 80% of the entire length of the palette. And if you're going to use it, it is pretty decent in width, so you can get a good look at your eyes up close if you're going to use it to apply your eyeshadows. And it does have nice clarity. However, it won't hold itself up. It will flap over like that, so you will have to hold it in place if you're going to use this to apply makeup. I personally don't use the mirror in palettes to apply makeup, but I know some of you do use the mirror in palettes, so just be mindful it's not a very handy mirror at all. And then at the bottom of the palette, the eyeshadows are laid out by the finish. So the top row, you have 9 eyeshadows, and those are the Metal Crush Eyeshadow formula. So these are more metallic, shiny, shimmery, frosty shades. And then at the bottom, we have the 13 matte eyeshadows, and these are all mattes. And then each of the eyeshadows do have their names beneath them in a silver font, which I truly appreciate. I love when eyeshadow palettes do have the names printed on the inside of the palette. And in addition, she does have it, again, the grid on the back with the names. Now, there is no light to dark theme in this palette. It's more of a grid of shade themes. So you have the greens and the blues on one end, you have the purpley, more rosy tones, mauvey tones in the middle, and then you have more neutral tones towards the end with a burgundy shade. And I like that the palette does have that cluster of colors together, because if you're a beginner and you're not sure what shades go together, what shades would coordinate well with another, you can just go in the little grids and pick out the color selections to use in a single look. But if you are more of a novice or a master of eyeshadows, then you can mix and match and do the most with this eyeshadow palette. And just in case you were looking for inspiration on what you could do with the different eyeshadows in this palette to create different looks, they do include this insert with 3 different tutorials with step-by-step instructions. And they even include a lip combo that you can use for the look. And there are 3 looks. We have Metal Maiden, Velvet Romance, and then a Metal Matte Mashup, which is just a combination of the different shades in the palette. So beginners, you can grab this and get inspiration here. And I'll just quickly mention the box that the palette comes in. It does have the same theme as the front of the palette, but on the back, this is color coded, which I wish the grid on the back of the palette was also color coded. That would have been really, really great. But it does have the eyeshadow names in a grid with the colors. The box also has all the information on the ingredients in the eyeshadow. So if you wanted to run through the ingredients, they're right here on the back of the palette. Now I do know that they are not formulated with parabens, sulfates, and phthalates. However, I will note that not all the shades in this palette are vegan. So if you're looking for a fully vegan palette, this is not the one for you, because the shade Twinkle pops out with the ingredient Carmine, which is not a vegan ingredient. Another thing to note is that it says Kat Von D Beauty has never tested on animals. However, the cruelty-free symbol, that little bunny symbol that signifies that a product is cruelty-free, is not on this packaging anywhere. I can't find it on the box at all. It's nowhere to be found. It's not on the palette itself, which is curious that that cruelty-free symbol is not included, which Kat Von D is big on being cruelty-free and vegan. So I wonder what's going on there. Curious. Now let's go ahead and jump into the product and the performance, and really quickly I'll read what's on the back of the box. It says MetalMatte Eyeshadow Palette. Unleash your inner alter ego. Are you soft matte or heavy metal? 2 extremes join forces in one high contrast palette featuring Kat's signature Metal Crush and matte eyeshadow formulas. And then on the Sephora website, it says the MetalMatte Eyeshadow Palette is a mashup of bold colors and must-have textures, celebrating the 2 sides within everyone, whether it's soft and romantic, rock and roll, or both. The palette's top row features an explosive lineup of exclusive, never-before-seen metallic shades in Kat Von D's max-pigment Metal Crush eyeshadow formula, including Synergy, a best-selling bronze from the original collection. So how's it never seen before? But you know what? We're not gonna dwell on that. The bottom of the palette is a rainbow array of buttery mattes in a range of tones from dark and moody to pastel neutrals, all in Kat's signature blendable pigmented eyeshadow formula. This palette's array of tones and textures gives you endless combinations for a number of eye looks. Get inspired by the 3 fearless tutorials, each with step-by-step instructions. Now, as I'm going through the review of the performance of these eyeshadows, I did want to include little clips of me applying the eyeshadow so you can see how they would actually apply to the eye in regular practical use, not just swatched on my arm. Now, overall, I think these eyeshadows are phenomenal. Again, there are 22 shades in this palette, and I did find that with a couple of the shades they needed a little bit more work than others, but not as many as you would think and not as much work as you would assume. The shade I had issue with in the Metal Crush lineup is the shade Twinkle. That one was a little bit looser, a little bit I guess a little bit more dusty, so I did need to apply that with a damp brush for it to really apply smoothly and give me even pigmentation. It tends to want to fly off and dust off, so that's the shade that you have to put a little bit more work into. Apart from that, the other shades applied really beautifully. Even the shade that I was worried about, Tinsel, which is more of a flaky texture, that one feels more like a pressed pigment, to be honest. And I was worried that one was going to be tricky, and I was like, I'm going to need to use this with a damp brush for it to really work. I did not need a damp brush at all. Just a stiff brush applies this nicely to the eyes, and it doesn't flake off or give as much fallout as I was anticipating. It does flake off as you blend it out with a fluffier brush, but it does apply nicely to the eyes. But again, using a damp brush will help it pick up even better with the pigmentation. But overall, all but one shade really gave me any kind of issues with applying them to the eyes, and I really enjoyed applying these eyeshadows. Now, the matte shades, I was very impressed by these as well. I was expecting them to be a little bit chalky and choppy, just based off what I experienced with previous eyeshadow palettes from Kat Von D. Her Shade and Light palette has a drier formula of matte shades, and even with her most recent palette, the Serpentina palette, which has similar shades to these, those gave me a lot of trouble too. But I found that the matte shades in this palette are a little bit smoother, a little bit creamier than the ones in the Serpentina palette. And if you take a look at her Shade and Light eyeshadow quads, the ones that came out just a couple of months ago with the 4 eyeshadow shades, these little quads right here, I found that these eyeshadows were a little thinner in formula, so they dusted away really easily and they had a tendency to thin out and dust away and blend away. These actually had a more robust formula. They were a little bit denser, they held together much better, and they didn't blend away just into nothingness. These I found really performed well. Now, there are a couple of shades that needed some more work in this palette, like the Linen shade, which is the matte white, and the Feather shade, which is that matte light yellow. Those need a little bit more building up to get opacity, but do you really want opacity from these shades? I'm not too sure. And even if you were applying them, are you going to use them in a full sweep over your lid, or are you just going to use them in a concentrated area? So those things you have to keep in mind. With the Feather shade and the Linen shade, I really wouldn't use these on their own, honestly, and even if I use them on their own, I would want a very sheer wash of them. So the thinness and the sheerness of the formula didn't really bother me as much, but keep that in mind. What I like about these shades is that you can mix them in with the other shades to create a lighter shade or a warmer, yet more yellow toned shade. So I like those to mix in with other shades, but again, they're a more sheer formula. Bone though, which is the creamy vanilla shade in the palette, really worked out beautifully. I was really impressed by that. And the other shades that had me a little bit worried were Moss and Ribbon. Ribbon is the purple shade, and purples are very difficult to do, but even that applied well. It built up well without blending out and getting patchy. It was really great how it applied. And Fringe was another great shade as well, and you can use that in the crease as a blend-in shade. You can use Suede as a blend-in shade. And then the other shades are a deeper tone. I would say if you're into more light looks and neutral everyday wear, this palette is not going to be for you. But if you're into more fun looks, more bold looks, then these shades are going to be right up your alley. There are not many light shades at all, as you can see in this palette, which I actually truly appreciate, because I think that more skin tones are going to get better use out of this palette than just light skin tones. You're going to be able to use this palette in a variety of ways, and I have seen light skin tone girls use this as well, and it looks beautiful on their skin tone. And Tara Babies here on YouTube use the shade Bone and Suede as her transition shade, so you can use these two shades if you're lighter skin tone. And I found for me, Suede works really beautifully as a transition shade. So I think that this is going to work for the majority of skin tones and for the majority of people. But again, if you're not into these shades, if the shade selection, like these bold tones, if you're like, oh hell no, I'm not wearing that blue or that teal or that green, and I'm not using that, and if you're looking for a neutral palette, this is not it. And I mean, it's kind of obvious that this is not it, right? So this is a palette that you would have to love the colors in this palette to get good use out of. But I found that performance-wise, they are spot on, knock it out the park. Kat Von D did a great job on this. And I was very surprised, to be honest, after the Serpentina fiasco and just based on my experience with holiday palettes. They just don't tend to be as good in formulation as existing palettes, as permanent palettes, as permanent eyeshadows. And this one, I will say, held up to the permanent collection. It is a beautiful palette, really well done. I love the shade selection. I just love the palette. I love how it performed. And these shades didn't blend out, fade over time. I got a full day of wear out of these. I got 8 hours of wear, 9 hours of wear. No problems. They didn't crease, they didn't fade, nothing. I just really love these. And again, do use a primer with these. They're gonna apply a lot better. Most people do use an eyeshadow primer, so that's not an issue. Now let's go ahead and do some quick comparisons of existing shades from the Kat Von D lineup to see if they coincide with any of the shades in this palette. So the first shade we have up is Paranoid from the permanent lineup of her Metal Crush eyeshadows. This one is a much brighter, much more vivid blue than the deeper blue that's in the palette. And you can see them here. This is Nebula from the palette, and this is Paranoid from the permanent lineup. Then we have the shade Iggy from the permanent collection. It doesn't really line up with any of the greens in the palette, as you can see. We have the shade Watt, and you can see there are two very different shades. You see there that this is the shade Iggy, which is a bright, vibrant green, and this is the shade Watt, which is a deep, smoky teal shade. Here we have the gold shade from the singles. This is Thrasher, next to the shade Flash. This is Flash from the palette, and this is Thrasher. They're close shades, but Thrasher is a little bit deeper, a little bit more of an old gold versus Thrasher, which is definitely a true yellow gold, but very similar shades. And then we have Raw Power, which is the cranberry shade from the singles, up against Volt from the palette, and the palette has more of a purpley tone, as you can see. And then of course we have the shade Synergy, which is also in the palette. And they are pretty much the same deep bronzing shade. This Synergy is in the palette, and this Synergy is the single. And they look pretty much identical. The single shade comes off just a little bit deeper than the one in the palette. Then we can look at the Serpentina palette, which has some similar shades in here. We have that deep blue and that deep teal shade. And here are the 4 shades. This is the deep blue from the Serpentina palette, which is a looser formula, and it takes some pressing to get that color to really stick, but it's a beautiful blue. And this is the Nebula shade from the new palette. Very similar blue shades. Then we have the green shade from Serpentina versus the deep green teal shade from the palette. They're definitely similar shades, but I find the shades in the MetalMatte palette to be a little bit smoother and apply a little bit better than the ones in the Serpentina palette. Then the only other shade is the deep purple shade. So we have Venom and Ribbon. So this is Venom from the Serpentina palette, which was a little bit powdery, a little bit patchy. And then we have Ribbon from the MetalMatte palette. I think both shades again are very close, and they have similar problems with building them up and being a little bit choppy. The only other similar shades would be Queen and Volt, but again, you can see that one is definitely more burnt cranberry and one is more of a dirty purple shade. And now how about the Mi Vida Loca Remix palette from last holiday season? This one had tons of shades in the palette. As you can see, there are blues, greens, different shades, and even some neutrals. The first shades that pop out to me are the shade Strutter from the Mi Vida Loca palette against the shade Suede from the MetalMatte palette. So this is Strutter and this is Suede. Suede is a little bit more of a caramelly tone, while Strutter is more of a neutral beige shade, but very similar colors again. Noble is also in the Me Vida Loca palette. This one is definitely a lot warmer than the other tones, but as you can see, these are three very similar shades. Then we have the shade Lemmy and Watt. Lemmy is a bright green shade from the Me Vida Loca palette. And then Watt is that deep teal shade again. I haven't found anything similar to Watt in any of her palettes. Then we have the shades Muse and Twinkle. This is Muse from the Me Vida Loca palette, which is more of a satin light lavender purple. And then this is Twinkle from the MetalMatte palette, which is definitely more of a shimmery, icy, light purple shade. Apart from that, we have the two dark browns. We have Vox from the Me Vida Loca palette versus Oak from the MetalMatte palette, which are not even close at all. They're definitely two different tones. The Vox shade from the Me Vida Loca palette is a deep neutral brown, and then Oak is a more chocolatey warm tone brown. Then we have the three deep cranberry shades. This one is Rewind from the Remix palette, which doesn't come close to Volt from the MetalMatte palette or even Velvet from the MetalMatte palette. They just don't look similar at all. And then of course we have the two matte black shades. This one is the shade Black Metal versus Jet. I think both are relatively good matte black shades. And then we have one more. We have Molder from the Me Vida Remix palette. This one is a light lemony ivory shade. Very beautiful pigmentation. Up against Bone from the MetalMatte palette. And then Feather also from the MetalMatte palette. I think if you mix these two shades, you could definitely get the Molder shade. Again, very similar shades as you can see. But overall, I don't think you'll be repeating too much from last year's palette versus this year's palette. They do have very different shades in them, and there are a couple of shades that are similar and may overlap a bit, but they're not exact shades at all. So, after all that, hopefully this review was helpful for you guys. I hope the swatches were helpful, and I hope the little application demo that I included was also helpful, so you could see the eyeshadows actually being applied to my eyes just over primer to see how they would apply in everyday real life scenarios. So as usual, I'll leave full details down below in the description box, as well as links to my Instagram and Twitter where you can follow me along. And until my next video, which will be very soon, guys, I'll talk to you. Bye.